Most people assume that if you're homeless in winter, you're cold. Full stop. That's the assumption. And for most people sleeping in tents or doorways or cars, it's true. But Decker, 18 years old, sleeping in a structure he found behind a strip mall in Spokane, Washington, wasn't cold. Not by February. Not even close. That's the part that gets you when you actually look at what he did. Decker Pruitt had been living rough since the tail end of October. He's not from somewhere dramatic. He's from Spokane. Born there, went to school there, and when things at home stopped working, the way things stop working in a lot of houses where nobody's paying close enough attention, he ended up outside. 18 years old, a gray wool beanie pulled low over two-toned hair, half bleached, almost white, and half his natural dark brown, cut uneven on one side because he'd done it himself with a pair of craft scissors he found in a donation bin. Narrow shoulders, hands that looked too big for his wrists, the kind of face that still had some softness in it, not fully settled into whatever it was going to become. He found the shack in the second week of November. It wasn't really a shack when he found it. It was the frame of one. 3 walls of old OSB board, a partial fourth, a roof that was mostly intact except for a gap near the back corner where something had come down on it. Maybe wind. Maybe someone had pulled a board loose. It sat in the gap between a shuttered tax prep place and the back of a Boost Mobile, partly hidden by a dumpster that nobody seemed to empty, about 8 feet by 9 feet of space. He measured it with his arm span, which he knew from a conversation with a gym teacher 2 years earlier was roughly 5'11". 2.5 arm spans by 2 arm spans. Not big, but not nothing either. The temperature in Spokane in late November drops fast. By December, it's regularly below freezing at night, the kind of cold that gets into your chest when you breathe and makes your fingers stop cooperating if you leave them exposed. He knew this. He'd grown up there. He also knew something that most people who talk about surviving winter outdoors never actually address. That stopping the wind matters more than anything else in the first 24 hours. A space that blocks wind at 30 degrees feels warmer than an open space at 45. He'd figured this out not from research, but from the 2 nights he'd spent in a partially open overhang before finding the shack. The overhang was technically shelter. The wind came through anyway. He woke up shaking in a way that scared him. The shack blocked wind. That was the first thing it had going for it. 3 solid walls and a door gap he could cover. He decided he was staying. What he did over the next 11 weeks is the part of this story that most people his age have never heard of. Not because the knowledge doesn't exist. It does, and it's been around a long time. But because most of the people who know it are 60 years old and learned it from their fathers, and it never got passed down the way it needed to, Decker got most of it from a single conversation with a man named Gerald who camped near the railroad switching yard and who had been living outside in various configurations for going on 12 years. Gerald was in his 50s, weathered in the way that outdoor living makes people weathered. Not old exactly, just compressed. He talked for about 40 minutes one afternoon when Decker asked him how he stayed warm. Most of what Gerald said, Decker wrote down on the inside cover of a paperback he'd had in his bag. He went back to that paperback a lot. The first problem was the gap in the roof. He couldn't heat anything if the heat just left through the top. Gerald had talked about this, not in terms of insulation theory or R values or anything like that, just in terms of what he'd tried that worked and what didn't. Cardboard over a gap works if you can keep it dry. The moment it gets wet, it compresses and stops doing anything useful. What works better is layering. Something waterproof on the outside, cardboard underneath it, and then something soft against the inside if you can get it. Gerald had used a flattened plastic storage bin on the outside, cardboard from a refrigerator box underneath, and a piece of moving blanket he'd found in an alley pressed against the ceiling. The layers trap air. The air is what actually insulates. Decker didn't have a storage bin. He had 2 contractor trash bags from a construction site 2 blocks away where someone had left a half-open box on a pile of debris. He used both of them over the gap, overlapping them, and weighted them down with 3 flat pieces of broken concrete he found in the alley. Underneath, from the inside, he pressed 2 layers of cardboard cut from boxes he'd pulled from the recycling pile behind a grocery store. And above those, a section of foam sleeping pad, the closed cell kind, the cheap blue ones that he'd gotten at a Goodwill for $2. The whole repair cost him nothing except that $2 foam pad, and it took about 2 hours. The gap stopped leaking cold. That sounds small. It wasn't. Before he fixed it, lying down at night he could feel where the cold came in from the roof. After, that feeling was gone. The floor was the second problem. Concrete under the shack. Concrete pulls heat out of a body faster than cold air does. Gerald had been specific about this, and Decker had circled it twice in the paperback margin. You can put on another layer of clothing and deal with cold air. You can't fight conductive heat loss from below the same way. The ground is always going to win that exchange unless you put something between yourself and it. He built a platform. That's the word for it, though what he actually built was closer to a pallet. 6 pieces of scrap 2x4 he found in 2 separate trips to the construction site, laid across 2 longer boards he'd pulled from a collapsed fence 3 blocks away. It raised him about 3.5 inches off the concrete. He laid the remaining section of foam pad on top of that. Then a layer of cardboard, then his sleeping bag. On the coldest nights, he added a moving blanket donated from a church supply table, folded in half over the sleeping bag. The platform changed the math completely. He told Gerald about it later, and Gerald said, "Yeah, that's the thing nobody tells you, because it sounds like extra work and people think more clothing will solve it. More clothing doesn't solve it when the cold is coming from underneath. You have to break the contact." The third problem took him longer to solve, and it's the one that most people looking at this story from the outside would say is impossible for someone with no money and no hardware access. Heat. Actual warmth, not just insulation. The shack could hold whatever warmth his body generated, once it was sealed and off the ground. But his body alone, in 9 below wind chill, was not putting out enough to keep the inside above 40 degrees. And 40 degrees all night is survivable, but it's not comfortable and it's not safe if anything goes wrong. He needed a heat source. He didn't have one. He had $7 left after the foam pad, and he needed that for food. He was not going to buy a heater. He was not going to run an extension cord. He'd thought about it. There was an outlet on the back of the Boost Mobile, but he'd decided that getting caught on commercial property in a way that involved tampering with their electricity was a risk he couldn't absorb. Gerald had told him about candle heaters. Not a single candle sitting on the floor. That does almost nothing in a space that big. A sealed candle heater. 3 or 4 candles under a clay pot that absorbs and then radiates the heat back out slowly. Gerald had built them. He said they work if the space is small enough and sealed well enough, and that a 4-candle setup under a medium terracotta pot could raise the temperature of a sealed 8x9 space by 12 to 15 degrees over an hour. Decker sat with that for a while. He went to a dollar store and bought 4 white pillar candles, $1 each. He found a terracotta pot in the back of a thrift store in the planters section for 50 cents. He had no bolts, which is how the more involved versions of these heaters work, but Gerald had told him the bolts are mainly to stabilize the pot and create a gap. You can prop the pot up with rocks or broken bricks instead, and the function is the same. He found 3 flat pieces of brick behind the shuttered tax prep place. He set the candles in a cluster on a flat piece of metal he'd bent up on the edges slightly to contain any wax drips. The lid of an old baking pan he'd found in a garbage bag and placed the pot over them, propped on the 3 brick pieces so air could circulate underneath. He lit it on a Wednesday night in early December, when the outside temperature was 22 degrees. He sat and watched it for the first hour. At first, nothing obvious happened. Then, the pot started to warm. He could hold his hand close and feel it. Then, within about 45 minutes, the air in the shack, which he'd sealed the door gap with a piece of moving blanket nailed in at the top to hang as a curtain, started to feel different. Not warm exactly. Less sharp. He fell asleep before he could fully assess it. He woke up and could feel the difference immediately. His nose wasn't running, his fingers weren't stiff. It wasn't warm the way a heated building is warm. It was warm the way a space feels when cold stops winning. He used that candle setup every night from December through February. 4 candles, 3 to 4 hours a night. That's the part where the $20 comes in. Candles burn down. He went through about 40 candles total over 11 weeks, buying them in bulk packs at a dollar store when he had money from day labor at a moving company that sometimes took walk-up workers off the street. A 4-pack of pillar candles for $2. About 20 packs over the winter, $40 total on candles. Not 20, but the shack itself, the patches, the platform, the pot, the bricks. That material cost him under $22. If you're counting just the structure and the heating setup, excluding the ongoing candle supply, 20 is roughly right. He also did something with the walls that most people skip. The OSB board walls had gaps where the panels didn't quite meet, and they had no insulation in them. Wood alone, especially cheap sheathing board, is not a barrier to cold. It stops wind, but it doesn't slow the cold the way an insulated wall does. He taped the gaps with duct tape. He found a partial roll on the construction site debris pile, probably half a roll's worth. And then he lined the inside of all 3 solid walls with cardboard, floor to ceiling, taped at the seams. 2 layers on the north wall which faced the alley and got the direct wind. 1 layer on the other. 2. He attached it by hammering the edges flat with rocks and tucking the bottom under the platform boards. That sounds tedious. It took him 2 afternoons, and the difference in how the space held heat after he did it was not subtle. The candle heater, which before had taken an hour to noticeably change the air temperature, took about 25 minutes after the walls were lined. The cardboard is doing what insulation does. It traps air in its corrugated channels. It's not as efficient as fiberglass bat or rigid foam board, but it's not nothing, and Decker had a lot of it, and it cost him $0. By January, the setup was stable. He had a sealed, wind-blocked off-ground sleeping space with lined walls and a working heat source he could run every night. The inside temperature, when he woke up, was consistently in the mid to high 40s, sometimes touching 50 on nights when he ran the candles longer. That is cold by indoor standards. It is not dangerous. He wore a base layer, a mid-layer, and slept in his jacket with the sleeping bag zipped. His feet were the hardest part. He wore 2 pairs of wool socks he'd gotten from a church supply table and kept his boots inside the sleeping bag with him on the coldest nights, so he'd have warm boots to put on in the morning. There are things this setup does not solve. It doesn't solve the problem of what happens when the candles run out and you have no money. It doesn't solve anything about safety. Sleeping in a hidden structure on commercial property is a situation that can end badly if the wrong person finds you, and Decker knew this and had a plan for it, that mostly involved being invisible and quiet. It doesn't solve the social side, the ID, the job, the way back toward a room and a roof and a lease. It solves one thing. It keeps the cold from killing you while you figure the rest out. Decker knew that was what it solved, and he was clear-eyed about it. He aged out of the foster care database when he was 18, which is how he ended up outside to begin with. Not a dramatic story, just the kind of quiet administrative fact that lands on a person's life without ceremony. He'd had 2 placements in the last 2 years of high school, and neither of them lasted. He graduated. He had a diploma. He had no address to mail it to. The combination of those 2 facts, graduated, no address, is more common than most people who went through school in a house know. He spent January applying for jobs at places that didn't require an address, which is fewer places than you'd think. Most online applications have a required address field. He used Gerald's address, with Gerald's permission, for the ones where he got far enough in the process to need it. He got a part-time position at a grocery warehouse 32 hours a week, starting February 3rd. He gave himself until April to save enough for a deposit on a room in a shared house. That was the plan he was running. The shack was not the plan. The shack was the thing that bought him time to have a plan. That distinction matters, and it's the part that people who haven't been in this situation tend to miss. When you're outside and cold, You can't think about the next 3 months. You can think about tonight. Tomorrow, maybe. Making the shack work, actually warm, actually safe enough to sleep without fear, was what gave him the space to think past tonight. Gerald had said something about this that Decker wrote down. He'd said, "Shelter is not the goal. Shelter is what lets you have goals." The night he ran the candle heater for the first time and woke up with warm hands, he lay there for a while before getting up. Not because he felt good exactly, more because he'd solved the thing he needed to solve, and for the first time in about 6 weeks, the next thing on his list was not survive tonight. The next thing was just next thing. That shift from tonight to next thing, that's what a sealed space and a $4 candle setup bought him. Not comfort, not warmth in the way a thermostat gives you warmth, just enough to stop counting hours and start counting weeks. There's a question worth sitting with if you've watched this far. What do you actually know about keeping a space warm that you didn't learn from having a working HVAC system? Most people the age Decker was have never had to think about this at all. They've lived in heated rooms their whole lives and never needed to know that cardboard in a corrugated layer traps air, or that ground conduction is a faster heat drain than air temperature, or that a clay pot turns a candle from a pinpoint heat source into something that radiates. That knowledge is not complicated. It's also not in any curriculum. It lives in the heads of people who've been cold enough to need it and survived long enough to pass it on. Gerald passed it to Decker. Decker ran it through a hard November and December and came out the other side with warm hands and a job interview he made it to, because he wasn't sick. The $20 shack, the candles, the cardboard, the platform, the sealed walls, they don't add up to a home the way most people use that word. But they add up to something, a space that holds heat, a person inside it who can think past tonight, a system that cost less than a dinner out and took 2 months to figure out and will work for anyone willing to do the work of understanding it. That's the whole picture. A shack in a Spokane alley, a kid with two-tone hair and 2 bug hands, and a paperback with notes in the margin, a clay pot and 4 candles and a platform made of fence boards, and the fact that by February, when it was still well below freezing outside, he was sleeping through the night